Major support for these programs is provided by Bank of America Merrill Lynch and Perfect Building Maintenance, New York Community Bank, Kilroy Architectural Windows, New York's Window Company, Greenberg Traurig, LLP, M&T Bank, Chase Commercial Term Lending. Additional support is provided by Briarwood Organization, Bruce Mosler, Capital One Bank, Cassidy Turley, C.B. Richard Ellis, Chelsea Lighting, Cushman and Wakefield, Dime Savings Bank of Williamsburg, Douglaston Development, DDG Partners, Hal Fettner, Durst Fettner Residential, Friedman LLP, Accountants and Advisors, Gemini Real Estate Advisors, LLC, Genova Burns and Gian Tomasi, Investors Bank, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Center at Syracuse University, James Orphanides, Centurion Holdings, Corman Communities, Madison Realty Capital, Margolin Weiner and Evans, LLP, Certified Public Accountants and Business Advisors, Massey Knackle Realty Services, Meridian Capital Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Sterling and Sterling, SJP Properties, Stonehenge Partners, the Wickoff Group, Urban American, and Ackman Ziff Real Estate, Ariel Property Advisors, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Goldman Properties, Moynihan Group, Muss Development, RAL Development Services, the Spandrel Group, LLC, Rosewood Realty Group, Terra CRG, Triangle Equities.
There are women in New York who have had a career in education, in Washington, in City Hall. I'm fortunate today to have my friend Janice Weinman Shorenstein today. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So Janice,
delighted to be here.
Janice, let's talk about your parents, because your mother and father were very, very interesting people. Tell me a little bit about your dad.
My dad came from Prague. He was born in Vienna but lived in Prague. Very, very committed to democracy and the democratic principles. That
He was involved with the Constitution?
Yes, yes. He actually, although not a lawyer, he helped write the Constitution for Czechoslovakia, which at the time before World War II was one of the greatest democracies in Europe. And when Hitler came to power, he volunteered to go into the armed forces. So he joined the Czech army, which then became the French army, which then became the English army, and he fought on the front line from '38 all the way through the end of the war.
Now, tell me about your mother. Your mother was also a very interesting woman.
She was. She was from Vienna. She lived in Vienna, and she immigrated to London at the beginning of the war. She drove ambulances throughout the Blitz, and she was a woman who was quite unique. She was a designer. She spoke 7 languages, my father 5, but she was a woman who really was extremely strong in her belief of principles.
And they met in London when your father was in London, and they got married in 1941.
Correct.
You were born in London.
That's right.
And then, now, it's very interesting when you were telling me that you never knew that you had relatives who died in the Holocaust. Tell me the story about your dad and that individual.
Yes, my dad never spoke about the Holocaust, even though he was on the front lines for all the period of time. He had a very large family, never spoke about them. I assumed that they all died of a natural death. I knew I had an uncle who was in the underground in Holland. But many years ago, when both my parents died, I endowed the United States Holocaust Museum with an annual lecture series in perpetuity in memory of my parents. And a very strange thing happened after the first lecture. A man came up to me and he said, "You know, I knew your dad, but I also knew your uncle." And I said to him, "You knew my uncle?" I had never met my uncle. And he said, yes, he was in Auschwitz with me. And your dad, I remember, because he came to liberate us. And he lifted me up. I was a 7-year-old boy. He lifted me up, and I'll never forget him. I said to him, that's quite impossible. My father was not in the liberation forces, and my uncle was never in Auschwitz. So he said to me, well, I have his ribbons to prove it to you. And he pulled them out. I wanted them, but he didn't want to give them to me because they were his memory of how he had been saved. And many years later, I was in Prague, and I went to Theresienstadt. And when I was there, I went in to look at the database because I knew I had had an aunt who had been there. No, there was no Weinman there. There was nobody from my family that was identifiable. So one point, my husband said to me, well, let's look under your dad's mother's name, Bandler. We looked up Bandler, and we saw one after the other who had come in, got their number, went to Auschwitz with their number. So the entire family on my father's side had gone to Auschwitz. I never, ever knew it. And they had persecuted there. Finally, during the course of that conversation or that inquiry that we underwent, I hear a woman from the back of the room say, Weinman, you said he was in Holland. I have the books from the deportation from Amsterdam to Theresienstadt, and here's his name. Paul Bandler, 1945 to Theresienstadt, and from Theresienstadt at the beginning of September to Auschwitz. So trying to put all of that together, I realized that the man, in fact, did know my uncle who had been in Auschwitz with him. And my father probably had come in his uniform, his English uniform, to Auschwitz to look for his brother. And that's why the man thought that my father was in the Liberation Army. I never, ever, until a few years ago, had any idea about the destruction of my family. And nobody's left, never knew any of them, just knew this story.
Your parents came over from London, and your father was a banker.
Correct.
And you grew up on the Upper West Side.
I did.
And your parents lived in the same apartment until they passed on.
That's correct.
Now, the interesting thing is you went to public school.
I did.
And then where did you go to junior high school?
I went to a public junior high school 118, Joan of Arc. It was
Joan of
called.
Arc. And then you, at that time, you also loved the piano. You had been playing the piano since you were 7 years of age.
That's right.
And you wanted to be a concert pianist, and you even had programs at Julliard, correct?
Yes. I went to Julliard for 10 years, and for high school, I went to High School of Music and Art, and I wanted to be a musician. I wanted to be a professional pianist. But you know, you have to be just above the standard. You have to be so unique and so special that unless you're not, you cannot really pursue.
So you became a doctor, so no problem. Okay, so you became a doctor. So you graduate music and arts in Julliard, and you go to Brandeis. How do you pick Brandeis?
It just had a warm feeling to me. It had a familial feeling, and it was at the time that I went a bright, energetic institution, and so that was my choice.
Now, between Brandeis and the summers, what were you doing?
I used to go with my parents. They went home, so to speak. They went back to Europe, and those were the summers that I spent.
Now, you told me you graduated and then you went to Harvard.
Correct, I went to Harvard.
Your degree, your undergraduate degree was in sociology?
Sociology, and my graduate degree was in sociology of education. I received a master's and a doctorate from Harvard in that field.
So now we have the doctor with the degree in sociology. So what does the doctor do in your job?
Well, before I went to my job, I did something amazing.
You went to the Indians?
I went to an Indian reservation. So I went to the Indian reservation in New Mexico, Pueblo Indians. I lived there for 6 months, and I did so because I was involved in a program called Project Tribe to decentralize the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools on that reservation to local control, which was a very, very big initiative at that time. And it was a very important opportunity for me because I learned about trying to overcome the barriers of bureaucracy. I saw how people who want to create their own existence fight against, forces that they can't overcome. But it was a wonderful experience. We did not do it. We could not overcome the hurdle of the bureaucracy. But it was a wonderful experience, and I've been committed to the Native Americans ever since.
So you come back and you get a job in New York City?
Yes, New York City Planning Commission.
New York City Planning Commission. And then from that you get to the Board of Education, right?
Right.
And what are you doing you were doing school facilities?
Right, I was doing school facilities at the New York City Board of Education.
And you also learned a little bit about politics, which we'll talk about later on, which had some changes in your life at a later time in your life. You then move on where?
After that,
Is that?
I went to Fashion Institute of
No, that's later on.
That's later.
Right.
Oh, I know. I went to Massachusetts.
That's right.
See,
You went to
it's
Massachusetts.
a good thing I talked to you.
Right. You went to Massachusetts.
I went to Massachusetts, and I became the head of statewide educational assessment.
Now, it's very interesting. In my research, a number of your reports have been written up and highly regarded. Let's talk about some of those reports about male versus female, moving on, no child left back.
Yes.
Let's go over some
well,
of those initiatives.
the first one I did was in Massachusetts. The others were later. But in Massachusetts, I wrote the first study of declining test scores, declining SAT scores, which laid the groundwork for later commissions, later national studies, and later reports on that very subject from a national perspective. But it was, at the time, a very interesting topic. It certainly identified the obvious, more television viewing, more after-school programs and so forth, rather than the discipline that was needed in the basic academic areas.
So you spent a couple years in Boston because there was an individual who was living in New York, Stuart Shorenstein.
Correct.
Stuart was a corporate attorney, and you moved back to New York. And what do you do then?
I moved back to New York for a very short period of time. Despite the fact that I came to New York to be with Stuart, I got an amazing offer to come down to Washington to work in the Department of Education in the Carter administration. And it was an amazing time. I mean, there was a great deal of energy, there was a great deal of optimism, there was a great deal of hope.
Lindsay administration was Republican, now we go to Carter, which was
certainly Democratic, yes.
Right.
And we worked at that time on the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which is now No Child Left Behind. And what that did was to reauthorize many of the programs that the federal government supports in elementary and secondary education. But the nice thing about being in Washington is that you meet people from your field from all parts of the United States, from rural areas, from inner cities, from different kinds of states.
Now, was Stuart with you in Washington?
He wasn't initially, then he came down and practiced there. But when our daughter was born, we moved back to New York.
So now you come back to New York, and what do you do?
Then I went to the Fashion Institute of Technology for 10 years.
But before we get to the Fashion Institute, I think the bug was germinating on you, perhaps from your parents. Your father had won an award when he was in the military, and from the Upper West Side environment. You decided in 1979 and 1980 to join the political club, the Ansonia Democratic Club.
Right,
correct?
Ansonia Independent Democrat.
Independent Democratic Club. And that really, so that was one of the situations which we'll get to. And, people say they want to be in politics, but I was reading that when you ran for city council, there were 24 seats on the city council open. What happened?
Yes, it was obviously a turnover year. Even in my own race, there were 8 people who ran on the Democratic primary. I guess it was a time that really people started to take in hand politics rather than leave it to the just general run-of-the-mill clubs.
So how did the daughter of this Vienna banker, and this, wonderful woman. Really, how'd your parents take this? They were still alive at this time. What they think of you running for politics?
This is exactly what they would have expected. My father believed so strongly, and as did my mother, in democracy. There wasn't a day that my father didn't say to me, "Don't take democracy for granted." They felt that this country really provided an opportunity for them. And they felt that it was critical that people participated in that process so that they could make it more real for others.
So there were 8 people in your
Primary race.
Primary race, and one of my fellow broadcasters over there won the race, Ronnie Eldridge.
Correct.
Did you ever want to run again?
I would have wanted to run again for a different office. I would have wanted to run for Congress, but I never pursued it. But I did a lot of community work. I was on the community board. I led a lot of different civic groups, and that in and of itself is like being in office.
You know, besides the community groups, I think it was then, but I'd probably assume that it was always during your life that you got involved with Jewish activities.
Yes.
But really, it was in the 80s that you got you got involved and you joined the Jewish Community Relations Council. What year was that?
Probably around 84 or so, or maybe even earlier. But the Jewish Community Relations Council, I started with the Jewish Community Relations Council by being asked to head up a group called Women for Women, in which Jewish women worked with the wives of the UN ambassadors to introduce them to Jewish life in New York. And I headed that up for many years, 10 years, simultaneously working in the Democratic Party, grassroots. And also I worked with another women's group that I initiated here, or that I helped create here in New York, which was called JAC-PAC, Joint Action Committee PAC.
But you were also involved with another women's group. I noticed you're on the board of
Women's City Club.
Women's
Yes.
City Club.
Which also is very, very active in promoting good government and equality in different kinds of areas, whether it's education or housing or the workplace.
So now let's go, how do you get a job at the Fashion Institute?
Actually, when I came back from Washington in 80, somebody suggested that I meet the woman who was the head of the foundation of the Fashion Institute of Technology, and she felt that it would be a good opportunity. There was an opening for the provost, the person who was in charge of all of the academic areas. And Fashion Institute of Technology at the time its president was Marvin Feldman. He was a great believer in community colleges and also in vocational education.
And that's when they changed to the 4-year degree.
That's right, they changed to the 4-year degree, and in addition to that, they also introduced master's degree programs at Fashion Institute of Technology. And I was there for 10 years. It was a microcosm of many, many things. First of all, it was a union organized institution, so you had the difference, the back and forth between labor and management. You had people who were academics and people who were practitioners in the field of design and merchandising and interior design. So it was such an interesting time because the range of people were so big. New departments were growing in jewelry design, in toy wear, and everything you can imagine. It was really a period of growth, and it was a wonderful experience.
FIT has and continues to be a great institute.
It is.
So from the Fashion Institute, where do you go?
I went to the College Board. That happened because I was actually approached as to whether or not I would be interested in the College Board.
Now explain to my audience what is the College Board, because people, they think the College Board in Princeton, there's a difference.
Right. The College Board is located here in New York. It owns the SAT, it owns advanced placement. It has developed many programs in financial aid, in counseling, in teacher preparation, many, many different programmatic areas. It's a very extensive organization that provides services and products in the transition from high school to college. It's an extremely large organization. ETS, which is located in Princeton, used to administer its programs. It does not do so anymore. The College Board actually both owns, designs, and administers its own tests and programs.
So you're with the College Board, and then it's Mount Sinai?
No, then I went back to Washington.
Right.
I actually became the president of the American Association of University Women. That organization is very interesting in that it has an association, it has a foundation, and it has a legal advocacy fund. And the foundation did some wonderful work during that time. Those are the two studies that you referred. One had to do with girls catching up to boys in their academic abilities in the sciences and mathematics and so forth, but not doing so in technology. At that time, what we discovered was that girls were using technology more as a tool rather than a conceptual device. That may have changed by now, but at that time it was a very important finding. But we also released a book based on a report that it was called Separated by Sex, which debunked the notion that single-sex schools make a differential difference or a value-added difference to girls in the academic areas. It did not. It showed that if you hold constant for everything, background, economy, location, you name all, school size, class size, teacher performance, that those were the variables that counted far more than whether or not a person was in a single-sex school.
So you're there a couple of times, now back in Washington. Now it's time to come back to New York.
Not yet. I worked in the Clinton administration before I came back to New York.
What did you do in the Clinton
I
administration?
worked again at the Department of Education.
You failed to tell me that when we...
No, I how could I possibly do a thing like that to fail to tell you that? Anyway, it was, again, a wonderful time. And we did elementary and secondary education. And we initiated many of the concepts that are in No Child Left Behind. Clinton, as you know, was a dynamic president. We worked closely with the vice president on the education area. And then I came back to New York.
Then it's 1998. You
Yeah.
come back to New York, and you take a really difficult job because there was the mergers. All the medical centers were merging, you know, the Columbia Presbyterian system, and then there was the Long Island Jewish North Shore. And then in New York City, the other merger was the Mount Sinai NYU. And you go up to be involved with the implementation of the Mount Sinai NYU Health.
Correct.
Tell me about that.
That was a very interesting experience, very much out of the realm of my area of expertise. But I had overseen 3 different corporations simultaneously at the American Association of University Women. So I was asked to come in to really create linkages, integration, I should say, across the external affairs areas of the 5 hospitals of Mount Sinai NYU Health. Those were government relations, public relations, community relations, all the areas in which there could be commonalities that would leverage across those hospitals. And I did that for 2 years, and actually it was a learning experience. I think it was a learning experience for the institutions themselves. And ultimately, I think you know that merger did not last.
Right. I mean, I think it was a difficult merger because of the medical staffs.
Yes.
I think that was really the problem with that merger. It wasn't the conceptual idea. It could have worked, but the medical staffs really looked at each other as they should have been playing pro football against each other because each one wanted to kill each other over there.
Always. But you know what? The one thing we did do is we did make an integrated consumer-based website that went across so that the services were identified and then the institutions rather than the other way around.
Then you go to kids. Tell me about kids in distress.
Yeah, I must say that I feel very fortunate that I was chosen to be the president of Kids in Distress Situations, KIDS. It is a remarkable institution. It was founded 25 years ago, and our founding board members are still active. The organization provides new product to children and families in need. It provides clothes and shoes and books and toys and home goods.
And one thing that was in one of the articles, they provide underwear.
They do provide underwear.
And there are certain items that really gives a person importance. They don't mind used or other things, but the underwear and the footwear are very important. And I remember there was this article about you doing some program with Cory Booker in
Yes.
Newark.
We do program. The programs that we do are done in affiliation with around 1,000 social service agencies. We solicit the product, and we get the product to these social service agencies. In 2010, for example, we distributed $102.5 million worth of new product. We reached around 5 million children. And we do it through these social service agencies in every single state of the country and abroad as well. But what happens is that the product that we get becomes integrated into the programs that these agencies offer. So books become part of literacy programs. Apparel becomes part of sports programs, or just being able to go to school. We have cribs that are used to give to families that would otherwise not have cribs, and we give them those new cribs so that it prevents sudden infant death syndrome, for example, because the children don't sleep in the same bed as their parents. So those are the kinds of things that these new products can allow to happen. Now, underwear is an amazingly important thing to families because it is not seen, but it is critical to the hygiene and to the self-image of people. This year, we are distributing 20 million Huggies diapers that we are receiving. And I can't tell you, there are families in this country who cannot afford to have clean, new diapers.
Right, and you, I think with only 2 minutes, I'll just make the comment. You said it's more important to give the clothing and the diapers than the food because they wouldn't buy that.
Right, they wouldn't buy that.
When we were getting together, besides the fact that you have a wonderful husband, Stuart, the most important thing that you've accomplished in your life is your daughter.
Right.
Tell me about your daughter.
We have a wonderful daughter. She's generous, she's broad-minded, she's kind, she's very intelligent. But most of all, I think she has the most terrific values.
And her name is?
Marissa Shorenstein. She is a good girl, and that's what any parent would want to have.
With 1 minute left, besides the Clinton administration, besides running for politics, something that you've really enjoyed is your life in the Jewish community,
Yes.
especially JCRC. Tell me quickly about JCRC, and you
JCRC
became the first woman president.
Yes, JCRC is an organization that really builds bridges in the city between Jews and Muslims and Latinos and the Christian community. And it does so in a way that really builds a community of like-minded people across the city.
So you've enjoyed that too.
I can't tell you how much I enjoyed that.
So, you look at it this way, maybe we didn't have a concert pianist, but we've had a wonderful humanitarian who's taken a role in the city, who's taken a role especially in education around the nation, and who's a great humanitarian. I'm really happy that you're on the show today.
Thank you. It's really my pleasure, and it's a pleasure to know you.